Why the US is failing at its economic goals. Why is everything so costly? And just what is the state of the labor market? The Federal Reserve, the central bank of the United States, is addressing the questions that we are all asking. That's what it does, after all, to promote employment and maintain price stability. The twin mission entails lowering prices while creating jobs. These are the two main obligations. It turns out to be difficult. Long-term, there's a trade-off between low unemployment and inflation. Through interest rate regulations, the Fed maintains price stability. Elevated rates of inflation. To reduce borrowing, raise rates. However, when interest rates are low, businesses may borrow cheap money and expand their workforce, which boosts the job market. This trade-off, according to some economists, is irrational. Maximizing employment and avoiding inciting price pressures are mutually exclusive. Others think it's essential to maintaining the security and stability of the U.S. economy. It gives those at the Fed who care about employment as much as they do about inflation more clout. The people of America are caught in either case. I believe it's difficult to convince the general public that your goal is to increase the number of unemployed individuals. It's not what anyone wants to hear. What is the appropriate threshold for torturing defenseless individuals? It's not just a modest amount or zero as you may have thought. Torture is not good. Here's what happens when the dual mandate's objectives begin to diverge and how the Fed attempts to achieve this nearly unachievable equilibrium. The dual mandate consists of two objectives: stable pricing and maximum employment. However, the dual mandate of the Federal Reserve wasn't always present. Late in the 1970s, the federal government was unable to devise any initiatives to mitigate this extreme degree of unemployment. That second mandate was added by them. The U.S. Central Bank has pursued this dual goal since the Federal Reserve Act of 1977 was approved by Congress, using its precise and potent powers such as interest rate adjustments. When a recession struck, the Fed had a rather good plan in place for handling it. Interest rate reductions by the Fed would encourage investment, expenditure, and consumption. When interest rates are increased by the Fed, when interest rates are raised by the Fed, an increase in interest rates causes people to borrow less and spend less. Employers will presumably eventually hire fewer people. Additionally, there will be a greater number of unemployed persons if firms choose to reduce hiring. Some foreign central banks have a more focused goal, namely to target inflation as opposed to the U.S. dual mandate. In certain other nations without a dual mandate, the central bank may feel overly reliant on the inflation mandate, allowing it to tolerate any degree of unemployment as long as it meets its inflation target of 2%. And that's not what we want. We desire equilibrium. For instance, similar to the US, the European Central Bank aims for a 2% inflation rate. However, employment is not addressed by the ECB. With a single mission, the European Central Bank implemented stricter monetary policy and higher interest rates than I believe the Federal Reserve would have. According to theory, the sole long-term impact of monetary policy is on prices. It doesn't have a sustained impact on employment, activity, unemployment, etc. The issue is that individuals will incorporate a softer monetary policy if they anticipate a central bank to begin focusing on unemployment. The Federal Reserve's monetary policy is closely linked to price stability, allowing it to manipulate interest rates and predict future developments with considerable accuracy. And that's just not how the jobless market operates, is it? Because there are a lot of other things besides the Fed's power over the balancing act that affect the employment market. 12 members, including presidents of regional reserve banks and members of the Fed's Board of Governors, make up the FOMC, or Open Market Committee of the Federal Reserve. They convene to scrutinize financial and economic data before deliberating on the possibility of raising interest rates. Weighing goals by the dual mandate. These are discretionary issues. It occurs when you reach those almost missed moments. Congress must give the Fed a clear mandate. These 12 voters must make this tough choice. Which should come first? Lowering inflation or keeping unemployment low? Achieving price stability involves maintaining a balance between supply and demand. However, attempting to push demand over supply is what it means to maximize employment. Recessions can be readily sparked by the risk of pursuing a low inflation objective too hard. Additionally, a lot of houses would have jobless individuals. The Fed is now announcing that it will lower inflation since doing so will improve the economy as a whole and ultimately lead to the creation of more jobs. However, to fulfill that second mandate, we must first cause the unemployment rate to grow. As proof that this mandate can be successful, some economists point to the U.S. recent decades of low employment and relatively steady inflation. For instance, the Federal Reserve sets a target inflation rate of 2%, and this has stabilized annual expectations for the economy among businesses and the general public. To give the traditional monetary policy some credit, people are aware that the Fed has an inflation aim in mind. The bar has not been raised all that much. And once more, that has assisted in attenuating the rise in inflation. Inflation rises as the nightmare 1970s spiral out of control. People consequently anticipate higher inflation, which raises inflation even further. Ultimately, several variables, including the status of the economy and more general political and economic trends, will determine how effective the dual mandate is. The issue is that there seems to be an inherent conflict in the Fed's efforts to keep prices down, making it seem as though it can only wage war on one front. Achieving price stability involves maintaining a balance between supply and demand. Just one mandate, a few economists think the Fed ought to revert to having just one mandate. The direction of Fed policy and monetary policy in general are at a crossroads. As it will ultimately lead to greater economic stability in the long run, I believe they may seize this chance to undo the events of the late 1970s and bring the Fed back to being a single mandate organization. To give people confidence that their purchasing power and store of value, which is one of the functions of money, would remain intact, it would be preferable, in my opinion, if they limited their attention to price stability. And I believe that it would make the world a more comfortable place. However, I also don't see that occurring. Some experts believe the Fed should concentrate on prices since it is hard to define and measure maximum sustainable employment in the first place. It differs greatly from the inflation objective, which, if one were to inquire, is universally understood to be 2%. That's the number. Additionally, there isn't a specific measure or figure for it because it's this more nebulous thing. Furthermore, the Fed may be tempted to maintain interest rates excessively low for an extended period if it is overly preoccupied with employment growth, which could eventually result in inflationary pressures. I believe that central banks still tend to be just a little bit overly inflationary. Why do we want to keep raising the average person's cost of living? And a 2% target accomplishes just that. It indicates that we want to raise the expense of life for average people. Why would we act in that manner? It's not logical. The Fed's emphasis on price stability has also drawn criticism for possibly ignoring the impact that growing costs may have on families with lesser incomes. How on earth can a guy ever save money? Many of us employees were not being compensated fairly. Going forward, businesses need to pay a little bit more attention to income. In that scenario, I believe a naturally lower unemployment rate would result, which would be advantageous to the Fed and this dual mandate. According to some economists, the mandate ought to be expanded to cover issues like financial stability, lowering income inequality, and even combating climate change. I will now genuinely shift my research focus back to policies that improve people's lives rather than macroeconomic policy. The only way to alter the mandate would be for Congress to take legislative action. Furthermore, the central bank retains some latitude in interpreting the legislation and determining how to carry out policy. Perhaps we should return to that one mandate. Because the Fed is always reactive rather than proactive when enacting policy, it causes the economy to swing too far in one direction before swinging back. And lastly, keep in mind one crucial point. The only things that can truly boost an economy's efficiency and enable it to generate more items with the same amount of input are innovation, productivity gains, and new technologies. These are the only ways to improve an economy's actual wealth, and raising wealth can only be done in that way. Did you like it? Tell us what you think of the video in the comments section below, and don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more interesting videos.